Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome along to the 5th Farmers Weekly Transition Summit. My name is Andrew Meredith. I'm the editor of Farmers Weekly, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. In this 5-part series, we're taking a closer look at all the issues related to preparing to adapt your farm business to survive and thrive as farm subsidies change and new environmental schemes are introduced across the UK. This is just one part of our big transition project, which also includes coverage in print, on our website, and a special podcast series. In each strand, we have been bringing together farmers from around the country and representatives from all parts of the agricultural industry to exchange views and tackle problems amid some of the biggest changes we have seen in decades. This is the final webinar in the first 12 months of this transition project, but the team at Farmers Weekly are already hard at work planning for year 2. Tonight, though, the focus is all about biodiversity. A common criticism of farming is there's a rising tide of complexity within our industry that is becoming increasingly difficult for farmers to understand and cope with. You might say in the past the objective was simple: produce food. If you can, produce more of it than last year and try to do it more efficiently. Alongside that, farmers have always considered themselves stewards of the land, but now the industry has been asked to do more than ever to help minimise its impact on the environment and contribute to tackling climate change. The government's manifesto commitments here in England include a pledge to leave the environment in a better state than they inherited it. Private companies are being incentivised by legislation all around the UK and by their customers to show how nature-friendly they are. All this feeds into farmers being asked to do more to promote biodiversity on their farms. But what is biodiversity? Why is it important? How far along are the government's plans in this field, pun intended, and what will it mean in practice and for whom? Tonight, I'm delighted to be joined by representatives from a number of our transition partners across 2 panels to tackle my questions and yours on this topic and try to plot a path through the complexity and the jargon. In this first session, we'll be speaking to representatives from government and the supply chain about the journey up to this point and what the future may hold. And in the second session, we'll be honing in on how these grand ambitions are taking shape on the ground and looking more closely at the benefits and pitfalls some farmers are already experiencing. We'll get into all of it in just a moment, but before that, let's have the first of 4 videos from our transition partners this evening, starting with this one from Barrenbrook.
Hello, I'm Mary Dawson from Barrenbrook UK. We're part of the Royal Barrenbrook Group, an international group of grass seed breeders and producers. And today I'd like to share a few thoughts with you on how incorporating grass and forage to your farm can bring about benefits to both the business and biodiversity. Livestock is the obvious link. Perhaps you're looking to introduce livestock if you don't have any at the moment, or you're looking to expand or make improvements to your existing livestock enterprises. The beauty with grass and forage is there are thousands of different options, so we can always find something to make a tweak and make an improvement. Generally, if you've got livestock, you're producing meat and or milk, but also remember the organic manure that you could be producing from housed livestock or the nutrient recycling that's going on with grazing animals. That's invaluable at the moment. If livestock isn't for you, you don't feel you're capable or willing to be managing livestock, think about supporting a new entrant to the industry. There's thousands of people out there always looking for share farming opportunities or seasonal lets. If you don't want to go down the livestock route, you can still grow grass as a crop. You could sell that grass off the farm, and I think there'll be lots of opportunities for people to be able to sell good crops of silage or haylage or hay this year. Perhaps you've got an anaerobic digester and you could use that as another feedstock or sell it for a neighbour who's got an anaerobic digester for energy production. And if you're thinking of further down the line, perhaps you might want to go into grass seed production. As well as producing the grass seed, there's also added opportunities for selling hay or haylage or for grazing that can be combined with the grass seed production. Grassland has a huge role to play in supporting arable crops. Perhaps you could undersow, or there's opportunities for post-harvest establishment. We can create wildlife corridors to allow mammals, insects and invertebrates to move throughout the farm. Integrated pest management strips are getting increasingly popular to encourage beneficial insects. There's a great course on the Basis Classroom at the moment about that. Grass is also being used to reduce weed burdens. AHDB shared some work recently where they showed that incorporating grass into an arable rotation for 2 years can reduce the blackgrass burden by up to 90%, but a lot of care and attention has to be done if you're using that approach. Legumes are an obvious example of how we can use grass and forage to reduce synthetic inputs. Nitrogen fixing crops are able to give you the ability to be able to reduce your synthetic nitrogen inputs. So we've spoken a lot about the business, but how about the value for the biodiversity? Well, if you're adding a new species of grass, even if it's just one, you're adding a new species. That's automatically bringing a diversity in the plants. But if you're already using grassland, we can introduce more and more species. The great thing about that is you're encouraging life both above and below the soil. If you have more living living roots underneath the soil, you're increasing the feedstock there and the habitat for more and more species. Soil cover is really important. It protects the soil and stops soil erosion. And all those living roots underneath the soil can act as a nutrient mop so that we're not causing pollution. And keeping the soils healthier like that means that we can improve the biodiversity of the microorganisms that are living underneath the soil. Carbon capture is also a really important one. ADAS shared some work in 2011 which showed that having grassland in an arable rotation for 6 years or more can increase the soil organic carbon capture by up to organic carbon content by up to 24%. So there's some huge opportunities there for improving the biodiversity on your farm with grass and forage. As I said, there's lots of different options out there. There's always something for everybody. So please do get in touch with us if you can think we can bring about benefits to both your business and your biodiversity with forage. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Baron Brugg for that thought-provoking video to get us started. Plenty of options in there already. So let's turn to our first panel to get the conversation started straight away. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by 4 distinguished guests. We have Madeline Beresford, Deputy Head of Land Use at Defra, and in that role, Madeline leads the Biodiversity Net Gain Policy team. Also from the public sector, we have Nick White, the Principal Advisor for Biodiversity Net Gain at Natural England. Nick's been closely involved with testing and implementing that, so it'd be interesting to hear his insights there too. From LEAF, that's Linking Environment and Farming, we're pleased to welcome their Technical Director, Vicky Robinson. Vicky is a former Natural England employee and Oxfordshire farmer, and at LEAF she is tasked with, amongst other things, growing their LEAF Mark Assurance Scheme. Rounding off this heavyweight panel, we have Steve McLean, the Head of Agriculture and Fisheries from Marks and Spencer. He's been appointed to lead the retailer's low-impact farming strategy as part of their 2040 net zero commitment. And like Vicky, Steve's also an Oxfordshire farmer. Thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening. And for those of you watching live, now is the time, if you've got questions already lined up, to start submitting them. We have some that have been pre-submitted as well, but I'm going to start with one of my own. And I'm going to come to you first, Madeline. I know that biodiversity is yours and Nick's specialist subject, and there's a narrow definition of that, which we'll get into in one particular area, the planning sector. But in the broadest sense, what is biodiversity and why is the government and Defra interested in improving it in a farming context?
Thanks. So great question. Really great place to start. So biodiversity in its kind of simplest form is exactly that. It's diversity. So whether that is diversity of plants in its kind of simplest form or of animals, so species. And that's what we mean when we talk about it. And I actually think it's really helpful to take it right back to that kind of basic definition. And I think the video we just saw was quite useful for this because my policy area is called Biodiversity Net Gain. It's got biodiversity on the sticker, as it were, in the title, but actually lots of other schemes that farmers can partake in. I'm thinking about things like carbon credits, nutrient stuff, natural flood management, also benefit biodiversity. So I'll probably talk a lot about biodiversity net gain, but there is a much broader application for that, obviously.
And is this something that farmers should be actively trying to promote in and of itself, or is it by doing good actions elsewhere, should we say, that it will indirectly be improved? Should they be chasing down a particular species to support?
So I think it kind of depends on the individual farmer, right? So I think in principle, we as the government have put quite a few things in place to encourage farmers to support biodiversity, but it does very much depend on kind of where your farm is, what species you might have in the area, what you're near, what you're connected to, and actually kind of taking it back a step, I guess. So biodiversity net gain was legislated for under the Environment Act. Another policy that is coming under the kind of Environment Act is local nature recovery strategies. So those are basically kind of a New England-wide network of what we call, I don't want to use too many like policy words, but spatial strategies that talk about kind of where we want to establish priorities for nature, and that's really important. So if you're in an area where a local nature recovery strategy is being developed, where that part of your farm or you're adjacent to something like that, you might want to take different actions, and you might be able to kind of get different sources of funding for those actions as well. So I don't want to say it's all about you as the farmer, but there are different things you might want to do depending on the kind of place you are.
Thank you. There's 2 or 3 things to pick up in there, but I just want to give all of the panel their opportunity to have a stay to kick things off. So Vicky, you were formerly a civil servant, now you're working at Leaf, you've got insight on both sides. I don't want to I'm going to be kind to the civil servants and not get them to be too political, because I know that's the one thing that they would rather not be, so I'm going to come to you instead for this. Biodiversity is already becoming a bit of a contentious word, isn't it? There's some farmers who'll be watching this saying, this is a nice to have, it may have been a justifiable priority a few years ago, but now there's food scarcity on the horizon. Cooking oil's already been rationed in the supermarkets. George Eustace, though, he says food production and environmental protection are 2 sides of the same coin. Is he right? And how can that be? Isn't it in conflict with each other?
No, I don't believe it is, Andrew. It's it goes hand in hand. And when you're talking about the environment, at Leaf, we promote the whole integrated farm management, so soils, water, energy, and biodiversity is a key part of that as well. And as we've just seen in the video talking about beneficial insects, for example, we need those habitats to support the species for the benefits of the farmers. And quite often, we don't necessarily know what some of these species are actually, the benefits they might be doing. That there is evidence developing out there, but there are still unknowns. So to me, that management and biodiversity on the farm does go hand in hand with good farming practice and that integrated farm management. So it shouldn't be contentious. It's part of the whole farming system, and it's a key part of that whole farming system.
Okay, key part of the farming system. Steve, you work closely with Leaf, M&S suppliers, many of them, if not all of them, you tell me, are Leaf Mark accredited. But your suppliers, like all farmers, are experiencing massive increases in input costs at the moment. Is improving biodiversity costing them more? And are you helping them out with that? Are you paying them more to do it?
Yeah, I think there's several parts to that question. I think there's one about the great work that already happens on farms and the opportunity that retailers, but the industry at large, has to tell a better story about the work that already goes on. There's lots and lots of stuff on social media. There's lots of negativity about farming, but it's coming from a very, very low base of understanding. So I think there is a real opportunity to tell the story of the great work that already goes on. Really got to echo Vicky's comments. Biodiversity and food production go hand in hand. So there is huge opportunity to find ways of improving not just food quality, but also bringing to life the opportunities for improving habitat and biodiversity and wildlife on farms. It is a particularly tough time. Inflation is like we've never seen before, and responsible retailers are definitely reflecting that in the conversations that we're having with our supply base. As you'd expect, We want to try and find a way through as best we can. The value proposition to customers has never been as important as it is at the moment, because they're clearly feeling a lot of pain in their pockets. So for us, it's about telling the story of where it all fits together. It is absolutely about supporting the now nearly 8,000 M&S select farms across the British Isles that we rely on to produce great quality food in a way that the customer gets the value proposition that we offer. But we also recognise that that value proposition needs to work for the farmer as well.
And you were telling me, there's lots of different segments of customer, right? And we know, as you say, the value proposition, the cost of that food on the shelf is really important to, well, everyone, but particularly lower incomes. But you were telling me only a few days ago, actually, biodiversity and the ethics of food has actually never been more important to customers either. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. We've done a lot of customer insights, understand where the customers are coming from. And, if you go back to COP26 and the TV coverage of that and climate change and the issues around the world, we know that climate, biodiversity are increasingly important to customers. So this is the opportunity for the industry to really tell its story about the great work that is already going on and the true position that's already on many, many UK farms, as well as what is the activity that we should be doing to further enhance that. So it is really important. It's part of the trust credentials in British agriculture. We've done a lot of work that proves that UK consumers trust British farmers. But there is a lot of negativity out there, and it would be foolish not to try and head that off and to tell the stories that are already going on. And yes, it's also the opportunity to go further and faster to differentiate the UK farming offer further.
So we've already got a lot of uses for the word biodiversity, a lot of people asking for it. But Nick, let's tackle your specialist subject head on then. Biodiversity net gain in the planning sense. Let's deal with that. So farmers might be getting paid in the future to promote biodiversity on their land as an offset from house building. Have I got that right? Just explain that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Simon. And it's not just house building, it's a whole range of development. So with the Environment Act that was passed last year, there's a coming legal requirement that will affect pretty much most developments that will take place in England. So any development under the Town and Country Planning Act, and then in the future, any national significant infrastructure project will have to deliver a biodiversity net gain outcome. And the way what they're required to do is they have to make sure that there's more nature post-construction than there was pre-construction, of a value of at least 10% as measured by a standardized biodiversity metric. And what that means for farmers is there's a real opportunity here for where you've got developers who can't achieve net gain on their own site, and many won't be able to. There's real opportunity then for farmers to contract with developers to provide them with the kind of shortfall of biodiversity that they need to meet this new legal requirement that they're facing. And it presents a kind of potentially 30+ year kind of funding opportunity for farms who can kind of demonstrate that actually through changing the management of their lands, introducing new habitat features onto their lands. They can then sell that to developers as a set of biodiversity units, which the developer needs to meet the legal net gain requirement. So the developer is able then to proceed with their development. They can demonstrate, actually, yes, our scheme is going to deliver net gain through a combination of things we're doing on the site and what we're doing through this contract with farmers. And the farmer in return is in receipt of a kind of substantial long-term bit of funding as well. And just going to your point earlier about like there's a lot of kind of challenges around at the moment around wheat prices and other changes that are afoot. That's true, but that's always been the case as well. I was just thinking, 30 years ago, well, the Cold War is just coming to an end and Yugoslavia was falling apart at the time as well. And a lot's happened in that intervening period. But this provides a potential kind of stable long-term income stream for farmers who want to enter into this system by contracting to provide nature on their farms.
So how on earth do you go about measuring nature?
Good question, and arguably you can't to some extent because it is such a such a diverse thing. But for biodiversity net gain, it focuses on habitats and particular habitat features as well that you'll find, and they could be anything through kind of woodlands, types of grasslands, through to riverine habitats, ponds, and hedgerows. And it's all done using a standardized biodiversity metric as well. So you kind of undertake a kind of an exercise of kind of mapping your land, identifying the habitat features you've got on your land, putting them into the metric. It will then provide you with a baseline value. So basically quantify how much in biodiversity units, and everything gets translated in this language of units. What's your baseline value of your land? And then you can then think about, well, actually, how could I try and improve that? Could I restore some kind of currently derelict hedgerows, reintroduce some new ones? Is there some ponds I could put into the estate? Could I change the management of an area of woodland so it's a better quality woodland, or I could even expand it? Change the management of grassland. You can put into the metric those kind of changes that you're proposing. You think actually it's ecologically possible for me to do that, and that will give you a predicted uplift. It will say you've gone from your baseline and you're likely to achieve this particular outcome within this 30-year period. And the difference between the two is essentially what you've got available to sell to developers. So you're basically selling them the uplift in nature value as measured by this metric that you can deliver on your farm, if that makes sense.
I think so. Can measure what you've got, take some actions, and then measure again in the future to see if that has improved the score. And the improvement is what you can sell.
Almost, not quite. So you don't need to measure again in the future. So the metric works on a prediction. So it predicts for you. And there's a lot of kind of evidence has gone into this and kind of science to say what will succeed, what are some of the challenges. It will predict for you what's likely to achieve, what's likely to be delivered. What you then as a landowner would need to, as a farmer would need to do, is if you've entered into a contract, you then need to provide reports back over the period of that contract to say, and it's down to you how you manage it. It doesn't give you prescriptive management kind of approaches. It's very much down to you to say what's the most appropriate management technique for my land, but then to provide reports back, and it would be back to the local planning authority to say, and these are the outcomes I've delivered. And by the end of that 30-year period, the expectation would be you have delivered the biodiversity uplift, so the change in habitats, the new habitats that you've said you could do. And that's the basis on how it works. So you don't need to do a second metric calculation. You're just doing these reports to say, actually, ecologically, I am achieving or I'm not achieving the outcomes I was expecting. And if you're not, the adjustments you're making to try and achieve those outcomes. Okay. It doesn't have that kind of prescriptive approach that some agriculture, land management schemes have. It's very much down to you in terms of actually what do you think would be the best approach on my land to achieve these biodiversity outcomes.
So that sounds like one thing that you've done to help with simplification of the scheme. And that leads me neatly on to the first question from the audience, a pre-submitted question. So Barnes Edwards, I hope you're watching this evening. Welcome to you if you are. He simply asks, how are Defra making this as simple as possible to access the funding? Is there anything else that you sort of learnt from previous schemes to help farmers and landowners grasp this opportunity with two hands, shall we say?
Yeah, there is. So there's one of the things we're trying to do is to make the management reporting as simple and straightforward as we can. So we're piloting a kind of standardized reporting template so that ideally it's simple for farmers to complete, simple for farmers to use as well, as they can report back against that. So that's something that we're kind of piloting this year, and we'd be delighted to for any farmers listening who want to be involved, please do get in touch. It's something we are piloting ahead of the introduction, because we want to get that right. We want to get it simple and straightforward. Also, if a farmer enters into this scheme and enters into a contract, they need to register their land on a new national register as well. And that's designed to make sure that people can see where net gain's being delivered and can track that delivery. And we're making the process of registering land as simple and straightforward as we can as well. And it will be available on a kind of publicly accessible platforms that you can go in and you can be able to see, what's being described for my land holding, what are other people's land holdings offering to deliver as well. So those are some of the ways we're looking to try and simplify it. But equally, this is still a process and a policy that's still being developed and ahead of implementation. So, and I'm sure Maddie wouldn't mind me saying this, we still would be really keen to hear ideas and suggestions from audience members, as well as things they think actually would be really helpful to help further simplify it as well.
Madeline, we've got a question here from Conrad Mallows. Good evening to you, Conrad. He's just asking, farmers know, and a lot of them collect economic data already, and landowners do, of course, for the June return, for their own businesses, and for all sorts of things. But is there any sort of legacy data out there already on sort of biodiversity? Do we know what we have now effectively at a national sense?
Good question. So presumably you'd hope that you could look up your farm and discover a baseline. That isn't the case. There isn't a gigantic national map, unfortunately, that tells you all these things. So there are, there may be historical sources of data. Nick can probably answer this one as well as I can. And it may be, you can look at one of the things we look at sometimes at a really basic level is a map. A Google map picture or things like that will give you a very high level. It won't give you the kind of, I suppose, ecological detail that you'll be wanting to look at for net gain. So you can't really sort of sell net gain stuff retrospectively. You would need to do some kind of work to look at what you have.
So I was saving this one for later, but I'll come on to it right now then. Richard Negus, hope I pronounced that correctly. Richard, apologies if not. He says, you said we're in the transition period now. This is getting implemented in 2023, end of next year. Should he be putting off any habitat improvements until then, really, if he wants to get involved with this and see a financial return for his work?
So really good question, actually, and probably helpful for me to kind of sort of lay out a bit of the timeline. So the answer to that question is, so we just did a consultation on the kind of overarching policy for net gain earlier this year. And one of the things we proposed in that is a baseline date from which you can kind of make improvements, to the nature on your land. So actually, if you are interested in doing this, I think there is definitely value in looking at what you have now and what improvements you can make. And one of the reasons, I suppose, to do that is that you can potentially also get more units out of that and out of using the metric. What I would say, however, is that the timeline you mentioned, so basically this becomes what we call mandatory in November 2023. Some local planning authorities already do a form of net gain, so you may be able, to make an existing agreement through that, depending on what the case is in your area. And we are basically hoping to publish some more information, so kind of response to that consultation, to what everyone's told us about what they think about how we're going to set up biodiversity net gain this summer. So I think, yes, there's definitely stuff you can do now, and actually there's potentially, if you are interested in doing this, a benefit in kind of that uplift that Nick talked about could be bigger if you start sooner.
Okay.
And
Yes.
Andrew, just very quickly, if I may, just to add to what Maddie was saying, absolutely, please do start now, because you can find, as Maddie was saying, that you could potentially more than double the amount of units that your land is able to generate as measured by this metric if you've actually started the work early as well. So it's in the developer's interest to look for farmers who've already done the work, because they will find actually there's more units available from that particular site and that particular farm holding than perhaps a neighbouring farm holding that hasn't yet started and will be starting from scratch. So you should be at an advantage, sort of in the marketplace as well, if you've actually commenced the work early.
Steve and Vicky, if you put your farming hats on for a minute, this is a 30-year commitment. That's quite long term. Would that be a concern for you? Would either of you be interested in doing this on your farms? And this is your opportunity to ask the experts your questions too, if you're not convinced.
Yeah, I think it would, for me, it's important for all farmers to look at how this fits into their entire farming system. 30 years is a long commitment, and obviously there is management, there are outcomes that need to be delivered. So I think it's not something to go into lightly, but I think it is a great another sort of option in addition to agri-environment schemes, which is really all we've had traditionally for supporting the restoration and creation of habitats on farm till now. So I think it's a great great alternative, an additional sort of string to the bow. But it does need that long-term thinking, and I think obviously at the moment there's been talk of quite high values for some of the for biodiversity net gain, but it's looking at that actually there's a 30-year commitment here. And what I'm interested in, I think, is that sort of landlord-tenant dynamic as well, because as I understand it, landlords will need to countersign and give landlord consent for a tenant to enter into this. So I think it would be really useful to actually have some case studies as they evolve. This is new. People, there's some people are sort of tentatively stepping into this, and I think there's opportunities here for farmers to share their knowledge of how they found this with other farmers as well, to build some confidence in this. I think that's going to be really important. So I think, Andrew, if it fits with that long-term ambition for a farm, and there's some land that's suitable. One question I have got is in terms of what habitats where, which sort of goes back to the data question you raised earlier. How does if I'm sitting here or my brother on the farm at home, and he's sort of saying, what's this biodiversity net gain? What type of habitats might be suitable for my farm? I'm interested in that and how someone would find that out, and also the link to the local nature recovery strategies, which obviously haven't been published yet. So there's sort of not that alignment there. So I'm interested in sort of that, what are the plans to align that and to enable farmers to go into this really, as fully informed as they can be.
Yeah, and I would just add, reality, we farm in a family partnership. The partners is not as young as we would like to be. We're fast approaching our mid-50s, and this is a multi-generational challenge or opportunity, depending on when you look at it. So I do think it's the longevity of the contract, effectively. And for me, it's a big consideration about what it means for the next generation. We hope there's a generation that wants to farm behind us, but it has to make sense. It has to stack up. And the biggest concern I've got is what the limitations for the next generation would be. That does not mean it's not something that we want to do, and it's not something that we will do. It's just that there's quite a big set of considerations beyond the here and now. But I agree with what Vicky's comments.
And just another thought is around tax, inheritance tax, and whether there's any, what HMRC are saying about, if land, is in biodiversity net gain, thinking of that multi-generational aspect, what does that mean for the tax situation?
And Andrew, Vicky's touched on a couple of important points there, particularly on the what habitats and where as well. But it is worth bearing in mind that, and going back to your original question about linking this back to development. So biodiversity net gain is to do with development. So there's an encouragement to try and deliver net gain locally as well, where it's offsite. So farmers where they've got lands that's kind of quite close to places which is going to be seeing significant amounts of development, be it housing or kind of other schemes, will find there's probably likely to be more demand for biodiversity units than farmers who are, say, in upland farms where there's less development taking place. It's not to say that upland farms can't access this scheme, but there'll probably be a greater demand for farms where there's a kind of close proximity to development. And then it's then thinking as well about what type of habitats do those developers themselves need as well. So it's what are the sorts of habitats that developments locally are likely or are actually impacting on. The kind of typically there'll often be kind of grasslands, woodlands, kind of maybe some pond type habitats, not exclusively so, but it's because the developer will need particular types of habitats in order for them to achieve net gain as well. So it's not as straightforward a case as just simply saying, I've got some chalk grassland that I'm going to make for sale for someone. They might not need chalk grassland. It's also understanding what's the market demand for as well, which will require a little bit of digging into. And I know there's been analysis published recently by Defra at a national level. Bodies like Savills and others have also published more localized analysis. So again, there is a need for some kind of research into what the market is as well.
Okay. Anything you want to respond to, Madeline?
No, well, I was just going to say, so I totally take some of Vicky's points about we are obviously making this sound very great and straightforward, and you can just go and do it and get all this great money. It is a reasonably complicated process, much as many processes farmers have to do are. That is kind of the nature of life. But I do think one of the things we're really aware of is we are trying to make it as simple as possible. And we, as Nick said, look, we are in a transition period. We are testing, we are trying to learn and make this kind of straightforward, but also, genuinely good for nature at the same time. And it's always that balance between those two things for us.
Yes. We've got heaps of questions coming in, which we'll try and rattle through, but I just want to make this clear. This scheme is for England only, isn't it? That's correct. Yes. And I'm not asking you to be an expert on all the devolved nations, but do you know if there are similar things coming down the track for our audience outside of England?
So there are individual developers that I'm aware of. Scottish and Southern Electricity, for example, in Scotland, projects in Wales that are also on a voluntary basis doing this. So people, depending on where they are in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, may find kind of locally that individual developers are looking at this and are quite keen on doing this. Conversations are also taking place with Scottish and Welsh government as well, looking to kind of learn from an English experience. Obviously, the environment is a devolved matter, so it's ultimately down to those administrations as to what they want to bring forward. But there has been interest in both the kind of policy and the metric and its potential application. The metric itself can work outside of England. It can work in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland perfectly happily, probably, and we know people are using it. But it does. But as you're right, the policy itself is currently quite specifically around England at the moment.
I suspect it might be like Elms, where they're sat back waiting to see if it will succeed or fail, and then they'll copy or not. Okay, Venetia Bell's asked a very simple question, hopefully. Good evening, Venetia. Thank you for joining us. She asks, do we need to be carbon neutral before applying for biodiversity net gain?
No.
No.
Good. No. On to the next one.
Just to add to that,
yes.
Actually, though, you may find with certain habitats that actually they themselves can contribute towards organisations or your own farm ambitions around carbon neutrality. So, peat's an obvious one in terms of restoring peatland and reducing carbon emissions from that. But equally, kind of woodlands, some grassland habitats, some wetland habitats can also make contributions to the carbon balance as well as the nature balance on your farm. But no, you don't have to be carbon neutral to.
Okay. Izzy Johnson from Sainsbury's Agriculture. She said, Nick, is the biodiversity metric openly available and free for farmers to use?
Yes and yes. So it's published. If people, the easiest way is just Google Biodiversity Metric 3.1 is the most current version. It's free to use. It's published under open government license. Yes, please do. And there's some guidance and there's some case studies there as well. And there's also an email address, Biodiversity Metric 3 at naturalengland.org.uk to contact us if you've got suggestions for improvements, or equally if you're interested in developing a case study around the metric. And we'd be really keen to work with farms who are looking to use the metric to work up a case study with you as well.
I should say, incidentally, we're very happy to link anyone who's watching up with any of our panelists this evening. If you leave a message in the chat and we can share your message with them, even if you don't want it raised this evening, we're happy to put you in touch. So if anyone wants to get involved in the way Nick's outlined there, or if you want to ask a question of any of our panelists, then please do let us know. Andrew McRobb from Paradigm Marketing, he's saying, can real biodiversity be achieved with vast areas on monocropping without changing farming practices? Or does it have to be by mixing crops and crop varieties or other regenerative solutions? So a question from an arable perspective there. Madeline, have you got a view on that?
Well, it's not quite within the scope of biodiversity net gain. I would say it's more of a kind of how you manage your land environmentally question. I guess it's probably if you are. It kind of depends what you're looking for your farm, right? If you want to do a more sustainable form of farming, if you're looking at SFI or things like that, then you are going to have to kind of cut up some of your land because you'll want to add in hedgerows, you'll want to look at some of those more sustainable farming practices. So I would say it's not always an absolute no, but probably you want to look at your farm as a whole and the different things you're doing in different parts, I suppose, and how you're balancing those.
Perhaps the way people should look at it, would I be right in saying, you know, they hive off their unproductive corners or the field which is 5 miles down the road? This isn't something you would see them overlaying perhaps their whole farm with for this sort of uplift process.
I mean, you could put your whole farm into biodiversity net gain if you want to, but I guess it's a choice, right? It's a choice for the individual farmer, but because there are so many other options, it's about what you want to do to balance those things. So you might have some of your farm in SFI, you might have, like you said, you know, a field or perhaps something that's by a river, or there's potential for other things like that, or you know, that has some woodland nearby, into biodiversity net gain because it feels like a more of a suitable piece of land for that. But a little bit tricky. I don't want to kind of give everyone this broad sweeping advice that they go and take. But I think, you know, that would be a sensible approach. Yeah.
So you mentioned SFI there. Is it right then that I would be unable to be paid for biodiversity net gain and for another environmental scheme at the same time?
So a common question that we get. So we actually put out some principles for kind of what we call, I'm going to use the wrong word for it, but additionality in this consultation that we published in January. So we are still thinking about them. We're really interested in people's views on them. But the main point about biodiversity net gain is that the outcomes have to be genuinely kind of additional to anything else. So, you know, it is about proving a kind of 10% net gain for nature across the piece, right? So, you know, you're probably not going to be able to do exactly the same thing. You're not going to count the same hedgerow twice for SFI and for biodiversity net gain, but you might be able to kind of mix and match them within your farm. Yeah.
But if I planted, say, a field of trees, they're storing carbon, that might give me a payment in one place, but they're also promoting biodiversity by creating a new habitat. So 1 tree, 2 payments.
So the way with biodiversity net gain is Maddie was saying, you need to demonstrate that what you're doing is additional to what you've already been paid to do. So in the example you've just given, Andrew, that your trees have been paid for, I'm assuming fully through your carbon sales. So there's nothing additional there that you could sell for biodiversity net gain. However, if you went in and said, actually, I could change the management here, I could improve the quality of this kind of little woodland that I'm creating in a way that increased its biodiversity value, or I extended the woodlands, or I added some other features around the trees, you know, some areas of grassland or a pond or something, all of that would be over and above what you're already being paid for in terms of the extra nature it's delivering. And yes, that you could then potentially, or you could sell for biodiversity net gain. So you can combine them. It's just being clear about what's the uplift, what's the extra nature that I'm going to be able to deliver over and above what I'm already delivering, courtesy of being paid through another existing scheme.
Steve, we're creating biodiversity credits for quite a specific reason here, obviously for offsetting the impact of growing houses, shall we say. But do you think M&S would ever be interested in buying a biodiversity credit to be able to demonstrate to the consumer that this steak on the shelf had done some good?
A really good question. Also a really difficult one to answer. I think the reality is you've got offsetting and you've got insetting, whether it's in the world of carbon or the world of biodiversity. And the value proposition is to stack up for both the buyer and the seller. So I can get it in the context that we've been discussing it so far. I think it is an interesting concept around what will be the expectation of the consumer on a particular product they buy, and how does the activity fit into the description of the product. So I'm not going to give you the definitive answer that you want, because I truthfully don't know. I think we're too early in the journey around where the consumer's head is, bearing in mind all the other inflationary pressures that are on us all, but on the consumer as well at the moment. But I think the concept of doing activity and being rewarded fairly for it is something that we definitely see as an attribute of the product. No doubt we could spend a lot of time this evening and a big argument around what is the right value for that activity, and it won't do any of us the call any good. But I think the principle of the value proposition has to stack up, and farmers will have choices around where that value proposition is, either as an offsetting, so either selling it off the farm and therefore out of the equation of the product that they would maybe supplying into processing retail, or insetting, and how you put that value into the product that is eventually ending up on the retail shelf. But I'm very clear that farmers aren't going to do it if there isn't a value proposition for them.
Vicky, you say that your leaf farmers probably are directly and indirectly improving biodiversity now through the actions they're taking under integrated pest management, for example. Do you feel that that they'll be able to sort of a transition across to demonstrating biodiversity gain a bit more easily, perhaps, than shall we say, the average farmer?
I mean, as part of if thinking of the leaf mark certification, there are control points that have to be met, and they're related to all the aspects of integrated farm management, of which biodiversity is one. So they are already demonstrating that they are managing land for biodiversity, Andrew. So that I'd say they're already there. Now, obviously, that's if they choose to receive funding for that, that's obviously they can do so. Some may do, some may not. And obviously, the biodiversity net gain is one option on the table for them to receive funding towards that. So, what we ask for is that there is an area, percentage of the farm, that is managed for biodiversity. And, the whole point of, and they have a management plan as well. And obviously the idea is they implement the management plan, but what it also encourages that year-on-year improvement. They will review it. Am I delivering? Can I do more? How does this fit in with the rest of my farming business? And to go back to Steve, you're obviously making decisions on the value proposition of what they're doing.
And just to be clear, then, I believe we have touched on this already, but would you say your members are at a disadvantage if they're already improving biodiversity because they've got less room to improve again and get that payment, or have I got that wrong?
No, I wouldn't say they're at a disadvantage because there's the additionality, as Nick has already outlined. There's the opportunity to improve. It's not about just creation of habitats. There's the restoration of habitats as well. So no, I wouldn't say that there's disadvantage. I think they're already demonstrating great things, but they might choose to do more. And obviously, looking at the financial aspects, it might be that this gives them the opportunity. They might think they might do more than they're doing already, or say improve some of the habitats they've got already on the farm. To be honest, no different from other farmers who are in agri-environment schemes at the moment.
Can I come in? Because I think that's a really important thing. Talked at the beginning about all our produce farms are already leaf mark accredited. It would be a fundamental failure in policy if farms that have demonstrated improvements in biodiversity were in any shape, way, or form penalised going forward. That would be wrong on all levels. So we need to find ways to make sure that is never the case.
Here's an excellent question from Nick Down at Velcourt. He asks, does Defra know the area of land required to deliver biodiversity net gain on an annual basis based on previous development rates? Any modelling done there, Maddie?
So I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but I would say have a look at the market analysis we've published. We didn't quite we kind of did an estimate. So the problem with it as well is, so when you're actually a developer, right, building something, you can also make a choice, right? So you can make a choice between just kind of leaving some nature on your development site, leaving a woodland or something, or paying for an offset. So any kind of modelling that we've done has made an assumption about whether people do that or whether they go and pay for kind of offset land. So I'm presuming this is sort of applying to like the whole of the country. So within that, we have a kind of assumption that we've made. Like we think there could be a market that's worth about 135 million. There's a certain amount of kind of units people would need, but it is just an assumption. So yeah, there's not a kind of hard figure.
And so, in short, then, putting a figure in general of what you might get paid per hectare or per unit, still a little way off then, really, until the market finds a level.
So I don't want to kind of like, it's a bit difficult. I don't want to say, oh, look, the thing is, you know, I guess, so indicative, you know, what we're hearing from people could be anywhere from like 20,000 to 50,000, you know, a kind of unit, if we call it. I don't know, Nick might want to come in if anything else he said. But again, that is exactly kind of what you said. The market kind of hasn't really kicked off yet. We'll see what happens in the first few years as well, because, you know, it might go up. It's kind of about there might be enough supply, there might not be quite enough supply. It could be high at the beginning and go down. So I think without it having kicked off, a bit hard to speculate. But that's just trying to give you some figures that are actually maybe useful there.
And one thing I think, just to add to that, Andrew, as well, which is, and a key difference, say, from farmers that are used to dealing with agri-environment schemes, is this: you're not in receipt of a set price. It very much is a negotiation between you and the developer as to, so you kind of factoring in, yeah, what are my full costs over that 30-year period, and please make sure you fully cost, you know, cover all your overheads, the management, the maintenance, your legal costs, the costs of monitoring, reporting, and then it's a negotiation with the developer in terms of what are they prepared to, you know, what's the point at which they're prepared to sign on the dotted line, and that will vary around the country to an extent. And it's possible at the moment that prices may be higher because there's less, you know, farmers and less people in the market supplying units. But equally, demand isn't as high as it will be in a few years' time. So we're not quite sure where prices are going to go in the short term. But my plea would be just for, you know, for farmers listening, please do make sure you properly cost, because, you know, you should be expecting to get all your costs back and hopefully make a bit of a profit from it as well.
We touched on the duration of these agreements, 30 years already a little bit, but Shelley Abbott has asked a question, you know, what safeguards need to be put in place, you know, to give landowners and farmers confidence that the funding will actually, you know, happen over that period of time and protect those habitats for that duration. You know, if a developer goes bust after 10 years, is a landowner still going to get their cash?
So I can probably jump in here. So yes, in short, so as I said, we're kind of testing some of these agreements, and actually Natural England's doing some kind of work with different kind of farmers and landowners around that. But our kind of assumption is that you effectively, you know, you could get the money as a lump payment at the beginning if you wanted it, and then kind of disperse it over a period of years. It's actually up to you about the kind of legal agreement that you structure there. So that would leave you, for example, not waiting for a developer to pay you in 30 years' time. And indeed, that seems to be what developers are keen to do, because actually they are kind of moving on to the next development. They're keen to say, we've paid for our units, we've kind of discharged our obligation here. Now it's on you to do the delivery. So it is about that legal agreement, and when that money kind of goes out can be, you know, set between those two people.
And we've only got a couple of minutes left, but just from the other end of the equation, then, you know, who's protecting the developer, from ensuring that the landowner is not doing some sharp practice, taking the money and then just doing practices in the opposite direction, shall we say? Is it on the developer to go out and enforce this? And what happens if the land is sold? Is a covenant on that land to ensure that you carry on doing those farming practices that have been agreed to, right?
Yeah, and perhaps it's helpful to come in here to talk about another thing that kind of was legislated for under the Environment Act, which is conservation covenants. So there are basically two ways you can secure your kind of I guess what we call like your kind of offset obligations. One is through literally a planning condition, right, which would be done by the local authority, and the other is through this thing called a conservation covenant, and it's effectively agreement between the landowner and what we call a responsible body. So they could be someone like, there's someone with an interest in basically nature. So there could be someone like a local wildlife trust, something like that, who are effectively interested in actually making sure that enhancement of nature is properly delivered.
Okay.
And just to add, Andrew, as well, so there is a need for the developer and the farmer as well for an element of due diligence here as well. There is work to be done, which will be coming out around guidance as to what's an acceptable failure, and nature doesn't always do what we expect it to do, and that's fine. If people have made best efforts, or equally, we talked about climate change earlier, and if your field has suddenly fallen into the sea, well, of course you can't deliver net gain because your field's no longer there. But there could be circumstances, and you're right, where actually someone just takes the money and runs, and then there does need to be a level of enforcement action undertaken against that individual as well. Something we're talking with Defra about at the moment. And as I said, everything does need to go onto this national register as well. So there will be a transparent public record of what you as an individual farmer have said, I am going to deliver over these 30 years, which you or I can look at any time of our choosing to say, well, actually, to what extent is this being delivered as well? So there is that transparency element as well in the system.
Okay, thank you, Nick. That's about all we have time for with our first panel. It's been a bit of a breakneck run through some of these issues. Thank you all for your questions, and apologies to everyone to whom we did not have time. As I say, we'll link you up with our panelists if there is any desire for you to follow up with them on any issue. But my thanks once more to Madeline, Vicky, Stephen, Nick for being so generous with their time and expertise this evening. We're going to roll straight into our second discussion in a few moments, where we look in a bit more detail at biodiversity at a farm level rather than a policy level, including advice for farmland, waterways and forestry experts on all of those. But first, it's time for the second and third transition partner videos of this evening. In a moment, you'll see a word from dairy processor Arla and plant breeder Germinal. But once that finishes, you will need to navigate to a separate window for the second part of this evening's presentation. After the video, please click the overview button on the right-hand side of your screen if you're on a computer or laptop, or underneath the playing window if you're on a mobile device. And there'll be a link that says, please click here to watch part 2, where you'll join the auditorium for part 2 of this session, which will begin a few moments after these videos end. So see you over there shortly.
Arla launched our Green Ambition back in 2019, where we made clear how reducing our carbon footprint and increasing our handprint is a key part of how Arla farmers choose to farm. However, the concept of regenerative farming is now being recognised by the business and by consumers as a mainstream approach to farming. And at Arla, we want to take a leading role in developing and scaling what it means to farm regeneratively and showcase that dairy farmers and our cows are a force for good.
You adopt principles, social, sustainable or environmental, that's regenerative. It's not we are regenerative because we do this. It's more maybe how we look at the business or the farm and make decisions.
It's got to be farmer-led, and farm, very farm specific, because we are so at the peril of the weather, the soil type. No farm is the same.
The pilot farm program involves general training on regenerative farming to get a better understanding of practices and principles, but it's also a very farm individual approach with a one-to-one coaching on farm, so that the farmers are able to understand the holistic farm management and learn more about this point. Of course, we also want to measure the impact and have data in place to see which practices, principles are beneficial for the farm and the farmers to scale that in the long term. And of course, we want to set up this network and learn from each other, together with each other, and really exchange the knowledge.
There's a few things that we've started doing that we would associate with regenerative agriculture. We haven't changed our business. We've tweaked a small number of things in certain ways.
In this field, we've left it to grow up. It's been a couple of months, and normally we would make hay, so tractor come in, mow, it needs to be left out to dry and then baled and then hauled back to the farm or fed out in the field, whereas this year we've done what we call standing hay, so left it, the wildlife have enjoyed it at a long length, and then we're working our way through it on an electric wire, so not very labour intensive, and this field is not a field which is easy for us to graze, so it's giving it a purpose and bring it back into the farm.
I want to learn more about what's going on underground, because we need to measure it, and which is something we're not doing at the moment. We think we're seeing physical changes in the soil, and we're seeing some changes in the crops, but it'd be nice to actually measure that in numbers. I like numbers, and see actually what's grams, kilos, percentages of what are increasing or decreasing, so we can adapt or change what we're doing.
The pilot farm network will benefit to all ALA farmers as they can get a better understanding of the principles and practices of regenerative farming connected to dairy production systems, but also, of course, to measure impact on farm and scale outcome. Overall, it's about creating data-driven proof points to measure the positive impact of the dairy farmers and their cows on nature and climate.
Climate change demands transformation. To improve how food is produced for our world, the agricultural industry needs not only to continue to adapt, it must innovate. Germinal is addressing this challenge with Aber high sugar grasses, a new generation of grasses scientifically proven to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from livestock. Developed over 25 years through collaborative research with IBERS, the Institute of Biological, Environmental and Rural Science at Aberystwyth University, these unique grasses contain elevated levels of water-soluble carbohydrates, commonly referred to as sugars. So, how do they work? Ruminant livestock have a primary stomach called a rumen. The rumen acts like a factory and is the first stage of converting plant proteins found in grassland into animal proteins, which we as consumers can digest. However, only about 25% of the plant proteins are converted. The rest are excreted as ammonia and nitrous oxide. Aber high sugar grass, with their much higher sugars in the form of soluble carbohydrate, feed the rumen microflora, enabling them to capture more of the plant proteins and convert them to amino acids, which are then turned into meat and milk. This reduces greenhouse gas emissions and increases both meat and milk yield, giving farmers better animal returns. Aber high sugar grass is a climate-smart grass. For farmers, it's a forage crop powerhouse and a significant move towards net zero farm emissions. Used at scale, Aber high sugar grass, also known as Aber HSG, is an intelligent strategy for food producers to proactively steer sustainable practices. With both agronomic and environmental benefits, Aber HSG varieties are already recognized by leading retailers who have adopted them into their supply chain. The agricultural industry can adapt with more responsible practices and productive products that reduce environmental impact. Germinal's Aber high sugar grass is a step towards a more positive food future.